Hi, I'm Elliot Margulies from the Mid-Penn Media Center, and welcome to a conversation with 10 of us and 11 of us around the table talking about something that's plaguing the Silicon Valley in many ways. It's the need for affordable housing. And we're joined by teachers who are driving a long distance. We're joined by people professionally working to build more, get more affordable housing one way or another. And we're going to figure out like some answers to the challenges of getting more of it in the Silicon Valley and why that's so important. So before we jump into our questions, let's do a quick round of introductions, starting with Josh, of just your name and who you work for, where you work.
So I'm Josh Bloom. I am a teacher at Palo Alto High School.
I'm Catherine Jha. I'm a teacher at Gunn High School.
I'm Violet Sain. I work for Actera, managing a program that helps low-income families in disadvantaged communities.
I'm Dwayne Bay. I'm currently with the Association of Bay Area Governments and the Metropolitan Transportation Commission.
I'm Leora Tanwatko. I work for the Housing Leadership Council of San Mateo County.
I'm Candace Gonzalez, the CEO of Palo Alto Housing. We're a nonprofit affordable housing developer.
My name is Sarah Chaffin, and I'm the founder of Support Teacher Housing, which is an advocacy group that's trying to build affordable housing for teachers.
Just grab it and pull it towards you. Yeah.
My name is Elaine Wong, and I am a local architect but a co-founder of Palo Alto Forward, a community group advocating for better housing and transportation options.
I'm Steve Levy. I'm a regional economist with the Center for Continuing Study of the California Economy, and I serve with Elaine on the Palo Alto Forward Board.
I'm Lisa Cornejo, and I am a music teacher in Palo Alto Unified School District.
Thank you all for coming after a long day of work. And we just had a meal, so we're ready for naps. But before that, we're going to talk. And let's start with hearing what it's like to, for you, Josh, in terms of how has the cost of rent or the cost of buying a house influenced your decisions and your lifestyle?
How long do I have to talk?
Well, just start. Actually, can you start with what might happen later tonight?
Oh, I was just telling everybody my wife's 9 months pregnant, so if I have to get up and leave, it's because I've gotten the call. So I don't expect it to happen tonight, but it could. What's my experience been like? Well, I've been teaching in the Palo Alto Unified School District for 16 years. I started at Gunn High School, and then halfway through my career, transitioned to Palo Alto High School. I lived in England for a year in between. Got married in between, which certainly changed circumstances in terms of housing. And I think, in short, I recognize first and foremost that I am incredibly fortunate. I have a lot to be grateful for in terms of my ability to get into the housing market in this area. I think, for the first few years, I was in my 20s, and I was renting and sharing an apartment with a colleague of mine. And, when you don't have a family and you don't have kids, it's something that, we certainly couldn't afford to buy a house. It wasn't even anything we were thinking about doing. At that point in your life, you're just kind of renting. But as I entered my 30s and started thinking about how can I get into home ownership in this area, it quickly became clear that, A, there was no way I would be able to afford a house in Palo Alto where I teach. Not even close. And then B, if I was going to afford to live outside of the area, there was no way I would be able to do it without getting help from somebody else, without getting cash, basically, for a down payment. So I'm very fortunate, and then I was able to get some help from my parents that got me into a one-bedroom condo in Mountain View. And I lived there for a number of years. When I got married, my wife moved in with me. And, for a little while, we had two incomes, and, we're paying a mortgage on a one-bedroom condo, and, things are relatively comfortable. But if you want to start a family, and you want to have a single-family home and not raise your kids in a one-bedroom condo, you got to start looking elsewhere. And, the short of it is when we got to a point where we were looking to buy a home, it again was not even in the picture to buy a home in Palo Alto. It wasn't even anything. I think maybe we considered it just to see if it was possible, and it absolutely was not. We looked a lot in Mountain View and quickly realized that there's no way we would be able to afford a single-family home in Mountain View. That at best we'd be able to afford, maybe get into a townhome or something like that. Ultimately it was the same situation. We could not get into a single-family home again without further help from parents. And again, we're very fortunate that we were able to get further help from our parents. And what's amazing to me is that when I bought the condo in 2005, and then around 2008, 2009, with the crash, the recession, and the housing market kind of crashed in this area, we were underwater for a while, and there's just no way of getting out. And then all of a sudden, things flipped, and we were suddenly well above water, and we were able to sell. And I mention this number only because it's so fascinating that we still couldn't afford a home. We were able to sell our condo for $100,000 profit. $100,000 in cash. Still couldn't afford a single-family home anywhere within 20 miles of where I live. And so we still needed help on top of that. We were able to get a single-family home in Sunnyvale. At the time, it was a 3-bedroom, 1.5. We paid $740,000 on a house that was offered at $700,000. And the most amazing thing to me is that just 2 years later, a very good friend of mine, a colleague at Palo Alto High School, he and his family had the exact same budget that we had when we were looking for our house, and they were already priced out of Sunnyvale. And they had to buy a house in San Jose, in a neighborhood that wasn't as nice as the neighborhood that we were in, and we were in a little pocket neighborhood of Sunnyvale. So we were very, very fortunate to be able to get in right at that time. And now, we're in a good position in terms of our home value, but if we ever wanted to upgrade, I got a second kid on the way, not that this house couldn't accommodate it, but if we ever did want to upgrade, I don't know how we do it. I'm not going to ask anybody for more money. And even with the home value we have now, home values are going up everywhere. So, you sell in a high market, you buy in a high market. Yeah. So that's kind of the short of my story.
Great.
So
Thank
again,
you.
I'm very, very fortunate. I got a lot of colleagues that didn't have the resources that I did, and there's no way they'd be able to get in the market now.
I actually remember when I first came to this area, we rented in Mountain View, and my dad came for a visit, and we had looked around to maybe buy for our first time. We found a house we loved. It was $230,000. Well, my dad's from Peoria, Illinois, and the houses, if it's $80,000, that's a great house. So he was like shocked. I mean, we couldn't live in the neighborhood with the 80,000s. And he says, this is going to crash. I just can't throw away money like that. So, I never did experience buying a house. But my kids have, so that's...
We would watch House Hunters all the time and see what home prices were in every other part of the country. And we'd look at like these gorgeous houses that were, they're talking about, $250,000. And we're thinking, how many of those houses could we buy with what our home is worth?
Right.
And yet, here we are in a nice home, but it's insane out here.
And
It
it's
really
not like correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not like the Palo Alto Unified District is not a competitive employer as far as school districts, but we're basically failing our teachers if we want them to be part of this community, it sounds. Catherine, tell us about your situation.
So my story has a much shorter timeline than Josh's. I am actually a new teacher to the district. This is my second year teaching, and it's been a roller coaster of a ride. So initially I'm commuting from Evergreen area in San Jose. It's nearby Evergreen Valley College. So it would take me about an hour to an hour and a half drive in the morning, and I'm not a morning person. So I would actually fall asleep several times on my way to school, which was very dangerous, very scary. And I often would tell people that this is not the way to go. I feel like my safety is, I'm not protected, I'm gonna crash very soon. There was one time I remember skidding centimeters away from hitting the car in front of me just because I'd fallen asleep. And once I would get to school, I was so exhausted from the drive that I would actually look to make sure no one was watching me and lean my chair way back and just take a nap for at least 10 minutes. And I needed that in order to have enough energy to teach the whole school day. And then once I finished the school day, I would want to leave right when the bell ended, just because I didn't want to sit in any traffic. If I waited at school 10 minutes longer, it'd be a 20-minute extension on my commute home. So that meant I couldn't stay to talk to kids. I felt disconnected from the school. I couldn't talk to my colleagues and connect with them as well. So it was just this burning desire to want to find a place to live nearby Gunn, although my budget was very low at $600, and I could not find that. I think average was about $1,000 for a single room. I got very fortunate. I played volleyball, and I met someone who told me he was a Gunn alumni, and that he lived only 15 minutes away from school, and that he had been living by himself for 15 years. And he had the spare bedroom with a private bathroom. Lo and behold, he wanted to do his part and help some way in education, and that was his way of giving back. So he gave me the room at my budget, and so far I've been living there since October. It's 5 minutes from here, 15 minutes from school, and just so much better. And I think that if I had not found the room, I probably would have had to quit, or I don't know, maybe triple a room somehow and lower that fee for myself.
Do you come from the Bay Area, or?
I do. I've been born and raised in San Jose. I went to Silver Creek High School, which is around the Eastridge Mall area. And I applied for several districts, but Palo Alto gave me the job, so I definitely took it because it's such a wonderful district to be in. And I'm really been happy with the colleagues, the students, and the staff, and it's a wonderful place to be in.
It's a great place to work,
Yes,
hard
and
place to get to.
I hope to live or to stay in this district for years to come, and hopefully extend my career here.
Thank you very much. And we have a third teacher with us, Lisa Cornejo, and if I pronounced your name right. Good.
Yeah.
And go ahead, tell us what your situation is. We talked on the phone a little bit.
A little bit,
And
yeah.
pull the mic just really close
sure.
to you.
So I also work in Palo Alto Unified, so I share the work experience that you guys do. It's a wonderful district to work in. I get the question all the time, why don't you work where you live? And my situation, because I teach music, music jobs just, they're few and far between for credentialed staff. So I am credentialed in 2 states actually, and I'm hopefully about to be nationally board certified. I'll know in December. And credentialed music jobs are very hard to find. So I live in Santa Cruz County, in Aptos on your way to Monterey. So it's a 48-mile drive from my house to my work, one way. This morning it took me an hour and 50 minutes to get to work. I got to work 7 minutes before I had to start teaching. I leave at 6:15 to make sure that I will not be late. But if someone crashes, last year with the mudslides, I missed 11 days of work because of the mudslide. I actually owed the district money back because I was honest and said they were personal days, they weren't sick days. And I literally could not get to work. There will be days I tried to get to work and there were down power lines and then the mudslide, and I finally thought, this is crazy, I'm going to die on this mountain. So I finally started to just call in a sub because it became impossible. So my situation is that I have 2 children and we love the schools that they're in, and it became very important to keep them settled in the school that they're in. So I taught in Santa Cruz County a little bit, and then this job became available, and it was just such a perfect match that I thought, well, I'm going to give it a try. I know I work far, I know I live far, but let's, just see if I can do it. And so, fortunately, I love my job, and it suits me just beautifully. I love my district, and what's happening for curriculum and student access with music in this district. And I want to keep my kids where we are. So I have made the choice to continue to commute. And the long and the short of it is that's where we can afford a home that allows us a school district that our kids really fit well, and also gives them a community of peers and activities that works for us. So it really, for us, it's all been about housing. We can afford a house in Santa Cruz County, and I can find a job in Silicon Valley. Therefore, I drive.
Is that, just to be clear, because you said you like living where the kids are,
Yes.
their school, could you afford to move to Palo Alto if you didn't mind your kids moving to this school district, if you sold your house in Aptos? I don't know how the housing values are.
It would be very, very different. So we bought our house for $670. It's on 3 acres, and it's a 2,000 square foot home, beautifully made, and it's a wonderful place to be. That home in Palo Alto would be around $7 million. So no is the answer. However, that's also because I choose. I believe that since I have worked hard and have 3 college degrees, and my husband has 3 as well, that we should be able to afford a nice home. And I think we probably could afford maybe a 1,000 square foot condo over here. It's possible.
Right.
With 2 kids, it's just not the lifestyle I'm willing to compromise.
Got it, yeah. Well, I'm glad we started off with the stories, because the human side of it is what motivates you people that have been advocates in so many ways. And I know that you've advocated for people up and down the strata of the economy, but tonight, if we can sort of bear in mind these stories of people that serve the community so in such important ways, and what hope is there in this area. So I want to turn the conversation toward the work you've done over the years in your respective nonprofits or advocacy groups, or if you've done some, chime in if you're a teacher and you haven't been, but you see something you want to add. Tell me, what has been the most difficult challenge that you've faced again and again when you're trying to develop a capacity of affordable housing? So just pull a mic over to you. Don't arm wrestle for it, but grab it and start the conversation. I don't know. Candace, you've been in this business.
Sure. I want to say it's an elephant in the room. A lot of people know that back in 2013, we had an affordable senior housing project unanimously approved by City Council, and that's rare. We had the political will. Unfortunately, it was overturned by the community, went to an election, overturned, we had to sell the site, and that was really quite painful. Years later, it's 3-4 years later, we made positive change out of that experience. We're now on target to almost double our existing number of affordable units. Unfortunately, none in Palo Alto. It's still it's in Mountain View and Redwood City and other adjacent neighborhoods. What's painful is hearing some of the conversations going on today. Everyone understands that there's a housing crisis, but not everyone understands that it should be a shared concern. And not be pushed off to other cities and other neighborhoods. And that's what we're really struggling with, actually. And just to add to some of the teacher comments, the last 2 years, this is the first time I've had so many teachers come up to me when I drop off my 3 kids at schools here. I have a 6-year-old, 4-year-old, and 3-year-old all in Palo Alto. And so many teachers have cried to me about their housing situation. I had one teacher a couple weeks ago say, I've been living here for 20 years and teaching here for 20 years, and my family's hanging on by a thread. We don't know if we can do it anymore. I have 2 kids in high school at Pali. We don't want to move, but we don't know what else to do. Can you help? I had a server at a restaurant when I came in, had been waiting for me for months. She's like, you used to come here all the time. I haven't seen you. When are you going to build more housing? I can't live here anymore. We're paying $2,700 for a 1-bedroom. I make minimum wage. So all of these stories are resonating, so I really want to stress, how do we make it a shared concern?
Thank you. Dwayne, you're an old timer in here. You've got almost as much gray hair as me.
Well,
Grab that mic, though.
I'll keep it really short, because interestingly, exactly what you said is what I was going to say as far as over the years, over decades of doing this work, the prime frustration is it's a challenge that belongs to all of us. It's impacts that belong to all of us. And even now that it's in the paper every day, everybody has family members, everybody knows people with specific stories. And even though the level of awareness is like way up to here compared to where it used to be, the conception that somehow it's just has to be part of who we are and how we structure ourselves and how we approach things is just not quite there yet. There are lots of signs of change. To pick one indicator, from when we incorporated East Palo Alto, the first ordinance that was passed was a rent stabilization ordinance, which was very intentional. Each community needs to decide for itself whether that's something that's appropriate there. But there was a 40-year period from when we did it until this last year before any other new communities in the Bay Area looked at that as a possibility, where there were local campaigns, where it actually went to ballot, where there was a discussion.
Rent control, is that what you mean by stabilization?
I mean rent stabilization, but the point is not up or down referendum on that. The fact that it even became an issue. There were multiple city council races where we need to do something about housing, no, seriously, was a campaign issue, and in the positive direction, not the other direction. And so, fortunately, I think we are at a different time, but it still hasn't turned up to the point where it's just common knowledge that we have to roll up our sleeves and we have to do something about this together.
Go ahead.
Well, everything that you're saying, Dwayne, really resonates. I think I got into this because as an architect and a designer, I see the possibilities and I see so many empty parcels and I see so much unutilized opportunity out there to provide housing. And I think one of the, and you're right, Candace, that, a lot of times it's the community that comes out up in arms, and it's very frustrating to hear them speak negatively, 3-story buildings along El Camino, it's going to create a canyon of hell. And that's I'm sorry, that's really not a canyon. You can walk into any charming European city with 5-story buildings, mostly housing everywhere, and it's walkable, it's delightful. We can make fantastic communities. We don't need to be afraid of density, yet somehow, these concepts get twisted and they get mangled in public discourse, and it's not helpful. And so the really frustrating thing for me, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic in that, there are a lot of people who really understand the core of the problem. I think there was a handout at one of the other sessions that I went to where, we've got 182,000 new jobs between 2010 and 2014 and only 16,000 units of housing. We're not creating the housing that we need in order to keep pace. And a lot of people do, I think they get this, and that we know we need to do something. But all it comes down to, and you mentioned campaigns, it really comes down to engagement. It comes down to civic engagement. It comes down to civic voices and participation in the public process, because what I find is that, I see the possibilities. When the possibilities get presented to the public, they immediately get quashed. Yet, I have heard from people who do react favorably and react positively to the community design ideas and the housing proposals that do come forward, but they're not being amplified or not being aggregated in the right places. So I do think that there is support. You said we've seen some changes, and I do think that we have seen some changes. I think the hard part and the frustrating part is getting those voices in at the right times when we need them to be heard the most. And this is hard. A lot of us here, we all have young children. It's an impossibility, if you've got to get 3 kids off to bed and ready for school the next day, to show up at 10 o'clock, or, to show up at 7 o'clock and wait until 11 o'clock for a public hearing. And there has to be better ways of community engagement. I think there have to be better ways of getting perspectives and input on different housing proposals or community design proposals. And I'm hopeful we can do that because I think the support is there.
Stephen?
I'll make a nerdy point, but it's really important, and then I'll tell you a story. The word affordable housing gets so misused, it's a barrier. Technically, affordable housing is housing that is subsidized for below market rate units. As Sarah will tell you and the teachers will tell you, they're not eligible. So if any viewers think you're going to help teachers and public safety officials and firefighters, their income in almost all cases is way above. They need to be helped through market solutions, or Sarah has some other solutions. And so the word increasing a housing affordability for middle class people is a much better phrase. The story is, Candace has a 61 unit project on El Camino, not too far from here. About half for low and very low income adults, the traditional BMR housing group, and half for special needs adults. Our child was a special need child and adult. Her project faces the same barriers that a 50 market rate unit small apartment faces half a mile up the road. They need a change in the zoning. They need the height to work. They need enough density to make the project pencil out. They need to have parking reductions so they don't have costs that cause them to lose their tax credit. And they need not to be delayed for 4 years so their board gives up out of frustration. What I hope for out of these discussions is that people who want Candace's project to go forward, and I'm working really hard, make alliance with people who might be able to build housing for teachers and firefighters if we can get the costs down, so that BMR advocates and market rate housing advocates are in alliance for housing for all, rather than feeling that they are in opposition to each other.
And the story, where's the story now? What chapter are we on?
It's on hold for our project in Palo Alto. We're waiting for a zoning that will actually work. As an example, under existing zoning on this site, we can only get 11 units, which would not be financially feasible. In another community like Mountain View or Redwood City, the exact same parcel size allows us about 65 units without rezoning. So that we really need to change the zoning code to make it financially feasible. I think, like Elaine, I'm optimistically or cautiously hopeful that there is change brewing, and these discussions I think are helping build sort of camaraderie and, like, let's find a solution for all income levels.
Sarah, I know you've been focused on this higher income level that is still closed out. And what's been the biggest challenge in trying to develop teacher housing where you are in San Jose?
Sure. Well, it's interesting because it's very similar. My biggest obstacle actually has been the planning department and then the political will of the elected officials and the mayor to move forward with the project. So in my case, it was slightly different. I'm a private landowner, so I was actually had the piece of land and was going to fund the project myself. The reason I was going to do it that way is to avoid issues with not having teachers qualify for the housing. So if I privately funded it, I would be able to have teachers qualify. And
Because you can make that decision yourself?
Right, because I can make that decision myself. If I take tax credits, then I have to have people that make $60,000 a year essentially and below live there. And most teachers, especially if their spouse works or it's a family, would not qualify because they're slightly above
60,000.
that level.
Yeah.
So that's why I actually came up with my model, was to try to help that group, which most people refer to as the missing middle. And in my case, I actually got the neighbors. I got the neighborhood association. I got the teachers union. I mean, I just there were hundreds of people that came out in support of this project to City Hall. We even got the planning commission to vote in our favor, but unfortunately, I needed essentially a zoning change, which is what Candace is talking about, and I could not get the mayor of San Jose and the elected officials to go along with me. And I also was really stymied by the planning department. For example, what they would do is I had to pay a $14,000 application fee just to have them look at my project. And then they really didn't want me to move forward because they had this theory that this project was going to ruin the tax base of the city of San Jose, even though it was only a third of an acre, and it actually was going to bring tax dollars to the city. So what they would do is every time, my project was actually mixed use. It was going to have commercial on the bottom, so it would increase the tax base to the city. But they would just, fee me to death. So
They would what?
fee me to death. So basically, what some planning departments do is if they don't want your project to move forward, they call for, let's say, an environmental report, which costs $40,000. Or in
I still don't get why they wouldn't want it. They weren't going to get as much taxes in their perception.
in their mind, they weren't. If instead of building teacher housing at my site, even though my site is an underutilized parcel of land, it has a big parking lot at the back that's not used, and that's how I came up with the idea. I'm like, we should put teacher housing here. In their mind, I should I have a little tiny house down in front, knock that down and build a huge commercial building, on that site, maybe 3 stories of commercial, because they'll get all taxes off that commercial as opposed to, 1 floor commercial and 2 floors residential for teachers. And I mean, it's too long to go into the details, but where I'm located is actually not even a commercial corridor. And when I bought my property, it was actually zoned residential, which would have allowed me to do, what I wanted. But I think it's bigger than that. The city has to open up its eyes. And, they talk about affordable housing and teacher housing and the missing middle, but then when it comes down to actually making a decision and supporting it, they say no. So, elected officials can't just talk the talk. They have to walk the walk. And I think that people have to, hold them responsible. There was just a huge backlash, against voting essentially against my project. So I'm actually going to move forward, hopefully at a different site. So I'm turning it into a positive.
Congratulations.
Because so many people were just up in arms.
Yeah.
But, we can't continue to do the same things over and over again, and which is no, or not making exceptions on fees or zoning. We need the planning departments and the elected officials and the community to get together and say we need, housing for our teachers, our police officers, our firefighters, our nurses, our social workers. We need to knock down these barriers to entry and move forward, and we need to not hire consultants to do another study that's going to take, 2 more years.
So there's obviously, it's easier, not that it's easy,
Sure.
but it's easier to get housing money from the government for people that really are dealing with a low income and
Right.
are, and are essential for the community and many other jobs that don't pay much. How do you get money in for this missing middle? Where does the money come from? I'm looking around the table. Did you want to continue,
Can I just,
Sarah?
and then I don't want to dominate the conversation,
but go ahead and throw
but
it in.
I just want to
Where
answer
does
that.
the money come from?
So, what they have to, my opinion, the best way to solve it is, for example, when we pass things like Measure A, you could just have a simple solution where you have a fund of money which you'll lend out to private and public developers at 2% if they build affordable housing for teachers, for the missing middle. So that way you're not dealing with a tax credit system. You're essentially loaning the money at a lower interest rate. So private and public individuals can build affordable housing, and they could also do, mixed uses. So for example, maybe if you build 100 units, 20 would be, market rate, 60 could be for the missing middle, and then the other 20 could be for lower income. So we have to just be creative, but I think just a simple fund lending money at 2% would be the answer. So.
Anybody else have some idea of what it takes?
Well, Elliot, at the positive,
Thanks. We talk in HLC a lot about building more market rate housing, especially apartments, especially condos, multifamily housing, and then also inclusionary housing. When you have market rate projects that are 15% affordable, 20% affordable, many times those BMRs are at 100% AMI or 120% AMI, and I hope I'm not getting too technical.
AMI, yeah, we're getting into the letters.
But the affordability, the people that qualify to live in those inclusionary units can make up to $100,000 a year. And these are a different income level than the 100% affordable buildings that Candace builds. And so it does provide a sort of different
And where's the
income
money
level, yeah.
coming from for those?
Those are from market rate developers.
Oh, so
They are responsible for providing a certain percent of BMR in there.
the inclusionary
yes.
zoning. So
Yes.
you're saying to them, we want, 20%, we want even more to be for any income level.
Many cities have this requirement. Most for sale units, some of them for rent units. But you won't get the kind of affordability levels of 30% AMI, 50% AMI unless you do it like Palo Alto Housing does, where it's all in one building.
What is AMI?
It's the area median income, and it's calculated by county.
For example, 100% of the area median income for a family of 4 in Santa Clara County, I think right now it's around 109,000, or it's gone up a little bit.
It's 113.
113. Okay. In Santa Clara County?
Yes.
Okay.
So that means if I earn this median, 113, that I could buy into a house because they've told the developer you have to make X number of units that are affordable to somebody earning the median.
Yes. Or they'll
Okay.
give a range that might be 80 to 120% of the area median income. But the problem is lack of supply. So there are many communities that just don't have the supply or are not building. In Palo Alto, we also work on the BMR program for the city. Our wait list for the for sale program is closed. We were telling applicants that if you want a BMR ownership program here, you might have to wait 15 years or more.
Right.
And that was being positive.
Yeah.
So
I was on that list for 17 years.
Did you get it?
I got up to number 32 or so on the list. And then I fell in love with somebody that owned a home.
you got lucky.
That, and
That appears to be the solution.
yeah, I mean, for a while I thought I could be a poster child for the renter on the list, waiting for ownership. But then I got so old I knew I wasn't poster child material. So I basically took myself off the list. I think I was maybe a year away, but how many people can wait 18 years? Sure. And my kids were already out of the house by the time I was in the top 30 or so.
Yeah.
They had already gone to college.
Can I make a comment on inclusionary housing? One issue is a lot of the towns have an inclusionary housing requirement, but you're allowed to buy out of that essentially. So it goes into an inclusionary housing pot. So let's say I don't know, you're building 100 units and you're required to build 20 affordable housings, units, you can actually buy out of that, and then it goes into a pot. And so what happens, I think one positive change we could make is not allow the buyout and require that those units be built, because that would increase the supply, because oftentimes it just goes into the inclusionary housing pot, and it may be, right, 10 or 15 years till something's actually built,
Right.
so.
So delayed. Stephen, you were gonna start
Oh, lots
telling
of
us
stuff.
where the money
Elliot.
is.
First of all, when they talk about $100,000, that's for a family of 4. They're not talking about an individual making $100,000 being eligible for subsidized housing. That's multiple earners. You have so many problems. I was at a meeting on Monday, and the advocates for housing for low-income folks said it would take $80 billion in the Bay Area to build enough housing for all the people on waiting list. It's not going to happen. And remember, no teacher, no public safety official, no EMT, no nurse would be eligible for that. You asked the realistic question. There are 2 things that will help the people in the middle. You asked, where does the money come from? I'll invite Dwayne. MTC, ABAG, the regional planning agency, has a active and burgeoning program of directing transportation dollars and other incentives to communities that build housing. We could build up that fund. The second idea, which is in the wonky circles but has been proposed for the legislature, is the state could backfill a lot of the fees and the cost. The state could change the property tax structure. Both of those things would reduce the cost of housing to the people buying or renting, but also provide money for the cities that they desperately need. Sometimes cities turn down housing, as in your case, because they're not getting enough revenue from it to cover the cost. So you need to bring the cost of the housing down, and you need to provide some incentives so the city can't say it's a money loser, it's a money loser, it's a money loser.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I do want to touch on the fact that cost is a huge issue, and as costs increase for construction, and I think Sarah gave a very good picture, we're feeing things to death. Palo Alto had a very small scale example. Palo Alto recently changed their ADU ordinance to make it easier to build accessory dwelling units, granny cottages basically. Palo Alto was building 4 units per year, 4 granny cottages per year before they changed this ordinance, and I think now there's something like 13. Yay! But one thing that I'm finding my clients are running into, and a lot of people who want to have cottages in their backyard are often long-time homeowners. They're often older. They don't, they may have already paid off their homes, but they don't really have, gobs of money lying around to build these things. And so I've seen construction costs increase significantly. We're talking about $400 a square foot. And, for a 500 square foot cottage, that's $200,000. That's still a large chunk of change. And on top of that, we're adding an exorbitant number of fees from the various departments, and they all add up. And so I was reading a report that, Stephen sent me, to build, market rate apartments is something like $578,000 a unit, and I don't know, maybe you can change this, but for the affordable side, it's actually even slightly more, $621,000. So the cost is really, really high, and every time you add on process, every time you add on fee, every time you add on time is money, that just makes housing much more expensive to actually create. And I think, as some people have said, fundamentally, we are at a supply, we have a lack of supply. We need to produce the housing to house the people who have come into the area so that more folks who have been in the community or are at different income levels can stay. And so we need to really figure out how we can get more for our money. So with Sarah's point about, okay, you can pay off the inclusionary zoning and put it in a pot of funds, but that pot of funds is increasingly getting you less and less and less and less unless we figure out a way to kind of bring these costs down, bring land costs down, bring development costs down. This myth of, I do want to dispel this idea that, market rate housing in general is bad, because it's actually a little bit easier for market rate developers to go get the funding to construct houses. And doing that actually relieves the pressure a little bit off of the existing stock. So, traditionally older homes, older, duplexes and apartments, they're more affordable, but when we're not adding the new apartments and we're not adding the new townhomes and the new condos and the new cottages, those older homes become more and more and more expensive. And so we do really need to think carefully about, the role that new housing can actually provide and help with the pressures that we're seeing on some of the older housing stock and some of the price pressures that I think a lot of you have seen.
Thank you. Dwayne,
Elliot, if you don't mind, I'd like to turn a question to my friend Violet and turn the conversation just a little bit.
go ahead, but talk close to the
Yeah,
mic.
we've all acknowledged that there is a shortage of housing. There is an acute need to build more. That's certainly a very big part of the solution, both for market rate and for affordable. It's also been observed earlier, though, that there are sort of real families experiencing, real pressures right now. Also, something on the order of 85% of all of the housing that we will have in the Bay Area, pick a planning time frame, if it's Plan Bay Area's 20 years, or if it's your local general plan 10 years, it's already here. Most of the housing that we're going to have 10 or 20 years from now is here. And how people are using that housing, packing more and more people into it, stretching it beyond what it was designed for in some cases, people coming back to live with their parents longer. There's just the experience of how people are in their homes, and I know you're going on a daily basis, sitting, talking with people about the experience of living in their homes, and I'm just curious what you're seeing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dwayne. As Dwayne mentioned, I have a very different experience from most of you here. The work that I do in the community of East Palo Alto and Bellhaven, I actually work with low-income homeowners. Mostly are elderly homeowners, people who are living off with fixed income, as well as families. What I've seen in the past year is that most of the time I walk in a home, there is like about more than 3 families living in this one building, 15 to 20 people average. People are moving from Menlo Park, they cannot afford the rent, even in East Palo Alto as well, because of the existing situation of the companies that are there. Housing costs have gone up. It's a very sad thing to see every day. Just last night, I was at a community meeting, and there were people that were living in their cars, RVs. Some people, they've lived in their cars for more than a year, and they were aggregated in an area that the city will have to evict them because they're not allowed to be there. And so there's about 50 to 76 people, families that were living in that area, and there is a meeting tonight to find some solution. But there was no solution last night. They were asking for help from, there was some fund available for housing, yet, the plan for that funding is to build housing, and you're looking at 3-4 years from now. But there are people out there who are desperate, who are homeless. I've been to homes where a homeowner is taking in about 8 people that work at Facebook. These are young adults who work as dishwasher, who wash dishes or do the labor work there, who cannot afford to rent. I've been to a home where a young adult is taking in about eight other people who also work for these companies. So we're talking about here, how teachers cannot afford housing. I'm in that category as well. I'm not a teacher, but I do feel for, but while you are in a community that in dire need, people have left. I think from data from one of the superintendent at the school district, I think they lost 1,000 students 1 year. People have moved out because they could not afford anymore.
Trying to speak up a
Sorry.
little. Because
So-
this is so important.
Yes, about 1,000 students. They lost about 1,000 students at Ravenwood School District. So those are the signs of gentrification in East Palo Alto. There's a lot of mistrust. There's a lot of protest. Even there are new groups that have come together to try and find solutions. But we are kind of like a long way to go. My work in East Palo Alto, I currently work with these homeowners to try and help them have a safer environment. I mean, most of these elderly homeowners, you go into a home, it's run down, they don't have extra savings to upgrade their home, so that's where I come in, bring in organizations like Habitat for Humanity, Rebuilding Together, and these are low-income families that are eligible for these programs. And so this is what I face every day. I wish there was a solution. There is hopefully, like some of you have mentioned, there is a need for the policymakers, planners, city, community have to come together and find solutions. But what I'm seeing in the community is just, pointing hands. We're at that situation where we could not, find a way forward. And hopefully, creating conversations like this, people are listening. Hopefully, people will come together and find some solution.
I have a question related to that because the RV situation, it was written in today's
Yes.
Palo Alto Online. It said that as many as 75 people are living along Week Street, in RVs and are being forced to leave. And I know along El Camino, it's become an issue where the city council wants to, everybody wants to make everybody happy. And there's no way you make everyone happy, but there's got to be solutions other than kicking people out who have to live in their vehicles just to stay close to their family and their work. So my question is, for those who've had the ability to look or talk to people in other communities, whether they're in this country or others, is there anything out of the box, out of the RV, that works, or do RVs work? And should there be places where RVs can park? But why do we have to, feel so hopeless? What's going on that might show us a way out of that? Is anybody aware of some answer?
Well, with my project, I was actually going to use modular construction to bring the construction costs down. And the company that I was working with is actually from Italy, but they build housing all over the world. And it's high quality housing. It can be built very quickly and very inexpensively, but you have to get the planning department at the various cities to agree to this type of construction. I think the other issue is, like, for example, the property that I have, I'm actually in a situation right now, I work closely with a group called the Mamas Unidas, which is a very low income, largely Latino neighborhood. It's the Washington Elementary neighborhood in San Jose. And one of the community leaders, her house was just purchased, she was renting, and she has to move out. And she doesn't have a place to stay. She and her family may become homeless. So I actually have the house that I was going to use for teacher housing, and even though it's a house and it's completely safe, it's zoned commercial. So I'm trying to get the city to allow her and her family to see if they could move in, but it's temporarily till they can find other housing so they won't be homeless. But technically, I don't believe that's allowed by code. So we're in a crazy situation where you have a vacant house, which is, completely not being used. A family could live in there, but because of zoning restrictions or even the back parking lot, I could have people in an RV if it was allowed,
Right.
come park there.
The ironies
So-
are sad.
So I'm gonna let Elaine take over, but there are things that can be done, but once again, it's the planning departments, and the political will of being creative, and people are homeless now, they can't wait 4 years. So,
Okay, Elaine, and if you can add, I don't know how many of you work with planning departments, but I imagine a bunch of you do. Isn't that part of their job to research creative solutions all around the world? And it sounds like you found one in Italy. Like, if you're a planning department official, isn't that what you do?
Yeah, I mean, I want to offer two ideas. Back to your point, I think I heard a really good one at an earlier conversation today, which was, short term, shouldn't we be thinking about opening up our empty parking lots, whether that's in churches or, big retail centers, and really letting RVs and folks who are in mobile vehicle situations, park safely and in a safe community. And I actually think that's a really important short-term option that we should really start thinking about. Many of you mentioned house hunters. There's lots of TV shows on tiny homes, right? And everybody is in love with this idea of the tiny home. And there are tiny home conferences around the country. I think there was one in Boulder last year. But I think Sarah, you really hit on it, which is that it's prohibited in a lot of places to put these tiny homes in people's side yards, backyards, front yards, what have you. And that's really unfortunate. And so to your question about planning departments, I think a lot of folks who go into planning go in with, good intentions and goodwill. And I think, again, this goes back to an earlier conversation about community support or lack of support and engagement. And I think if we all here collectively said, we love this tiny home idea, we are really going to have to advocate for it and bring our voices together and amplify those voices in order to make that happen and support. Because what planning departments now, I think, and across the board, they're being conservative because they see a lot of negative feedback from proposals like this. And so I think there's a lot of invisibilia, a lot of regulatory stuff that governs what can and can't be built, especially around housing. I offered an example earlier today. My house is basically illegal. It was built in 1891. It was a cute cottage. But if you were to tear that house down today and try to build it again, you could not do it because it breaks so many rules that are on the zoning books today. So we really need to think about what rules exist today, need to understand how that affects our communities and how it affects the people who can and cannot be here. And if we really want change, I think that's one of the reasons why I am optimistic. I think slowly people, as they peel the layers of the onion, realize that there are a lot of very detailed and cumbersome regulatory things that need to change, and it's going to have to changing that will require a lot of grassroots support. So
I just want to add that there's actually an example of a tiny home in East Palo Alto. It's on Daphne Road if you want to look at it. The family has been trying to put that home on the ground, but the city is not allowing them. So I think last time I talked to the homeowner, they're gonna have to move it somewhere else because of, it's not within the requirements of the city. So there's a lot of red tapes, and I think that is also another problem.
I'd like to circle back to something that 2 or 3 people brought up in the beginning, and that was the shared concern. Because you're now talking about that, okay, nobody's a bad guy, but when you're in the planning department and you're not getting a push from the neighbors and from the people that live already in the community to feel like, hey, our teachers need to be here. Our nurses, our police and fire, they need to be in this community. And there's so many reasons for that. What changes that, and is there anybody trying to change that in a way that's working? Is anybody? And Lisa, did you want to throw in something?
It was just exactly
Yeah,
on.
grab
yeah,
the mic.
Just on that subject of it being a shared concern, Candace mentioned that's really obviously where it's at. And because everybody is pointing fingers, there isn't this feeling that we need to get the community engaged, like you were just saying. And when we start to feel the pull of what it would mean for essential workers, our groceries and our teachers, our firefighter, our police, if there, I'm being totally silly at this point, but if there was a way for our communities to feel what it would feel like for a week, that only people that live 10 miles within a 10-mile radius, they would have no childcare. They would have no gas. They would have no gasoline. They would have no bank tellers. They would have no teachers. They would have no fire or police, and on and on and on the list. Then they would start to go, oh, this hurts a little bit. Maybe we should get involved with a solution, because what's happening is we're building or attracting higher and higher and higher income jobs and no housing except for the higher and higher income earners. And thus it continues to spiral. I read recently that if in Palo Alto we had an earthquake, we would not be able to get service from all that I mentioned, police and fire. The likelihood of them being able to get into the community because they all live outside of that we would be in dire straits. And that really impacted me. My students always ask me, are you coming to the carnival? Are you coming to the extra thing after school or on Saturdays? And I feel so guilty because I always say no. And it's because it's an hour, well, because I live where I do, it can be sometimes 2 hours to get there and usually 3 hours to get home, just because of the way it all works. So I'm not part of the community, and we should be. All of us should be.
Stephen.
If it's a shared concern, then the 3 of you go arm in arm to meetings around the community, saying you stand for each other. And the people I care passionately about are not, in God's eyes, any more important than the other. And then the 3 of you go arm in arm with a market rate developer for a postdoc or a tech worker. That's when it's a shared concern. I had a dear friend come into our Palo Alto Forward meeting and say, I only care about people who make less than 60% of the average median income. I don't care about anybody else. That's what I face in my life. I face people who are passionate about their folks, and then that's not a shared concern. And everybody's concern has to be built so we can overpower the people who voted down Candace's project for 60 low-income seniors. We need to visibly show it's a shared concern.
Thank you. Who else has an idea about?
I just wanted to quickly underscore that, and put a little bit of a twist on it. I was given that part of my day job is with the Association of Bay Area Governments, and we work very closely with municipal planners. We staff an organization called the Bay Area Planning Directors Association. Planners follow rules. Some planners definitely are involved in long-range planning and doing processes to help make the rules. They spend a lot of time at the counter interpreting the rules. The part of this conversation that moves toward developing a common community will, going arm in arm to hearings, to committee meetings, to organizations of organizations that, Laura, that's your day job, we collectively need a voice. We have to be talking to supervisors and council members and planning commissioners. And yes, there are more creative and less creative planners at the counter, but ultimately, communities have the rules that they put in place upon themselves in order to preserve their communities in the way that they are and the way that they think they like them. And so bringing the message forward that this is not a side effect, this is not, a byproduct, this is not sort of an asterisk, this is in fact, something that we've made for ourselves that we're living in the middle of, and we can just as well do something about it really, really quickly. And I get to say this, with a little bit of wisdom. I hope just for a few extra years. By the way, go Gun, graduate. I had fabulous teachers at Gun. It was quite a while ago.
That's when they could live there.
So that's right. When I was at Gun, it was just after the Bay Area had decided that we weren't going to fill in the Bay. Yeah. I mean, that was literally a decision, and we'd filled in a third of it, and we were moving pretty quickly toward a half. Yeah. Okay, and we just collectively decided from the point of when a few people were having a few kitchen table meetings and writing a few op-ed pieces and things like that to when it was basically law, was certainly less than 20 years, and the brunt of it was like a 10-year period. And then later, from just within a few years after I got out of high school, within the next 3 to 5 years, we decided that we weren't going to fill up the whole Bay Area with an even smear of housing. We started imposing upon ourselves urban growth boundaries. 280 was designed as a central freeway for the peninsula, and now it's an edge freeway. That went from a few people talking about it and a few organizations starting themselves to do something about it to open space district and urban growth boundaries and just rethinking how we were going to grow and where we were going to grow. Maybe we're on the cusp of doing something like that again. I sure hope so. But it's going to take something like that where we just reconceive how we live here together.
And to make that evolution happen, you're saying it's still the hard work of going arm in arm and having coffees and meetings and showing up at these proceedings? Is that, or is there some other way?
It's that and everything else.
Yes.
I am not going to opine further on how to do it. That is why we're here, and everybody here obviously is part of the solution in some way. This is the avant-garde. One of the things that I hope can come out tonight, if there really are dozens, scores of these conversations and 100 people happening, is that we notice each other and notice that we're not alone. And I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I know 3.5 of you. And
The half.
well, there's somebody I don't know that well, I know of.
Okay.
And every one of the people who is at this level of involvement knows 10 or 20 people who are as plugged into whatever their particular levers of influence are. And those people, you know, again, it's a multiplier. So we need to recognize each other and work together on this.
So I want to ask a question related to the arm in arm concept. One arm that wasn't in your picture was the arm of the commuter. We got, you know, a few tonight. But I noticed that when people show up at the meetings, it's usually people that live in the community who don't want too much to change, or at least that's a strong voice. And the people that have been probably in their cars while that meeting's going on aren't visible. So how does that change? Or is it changing that you're already part of something that's creating change?
Well, I think as someone who's done organizing around housing for the past 4 years, it's very helpful to have members who live in the community who vote to be the ones talking to the council members. I personally have gone to Oakland and talked to Oakland elected officials about their housing. They didn't put any stock into what I was saying, even though housing in Oakland affects housing in Palo Alto, and it's a regional problem, and everyone is saying it's a regional problem. But when it comes to making decisions, elected officials listen to the people that vote for them. And I actually don't really think that if you don't live in a community that it's effective to organize people that live outside of a community to go to another community and speak to the elected officials.
Elliot, one of the wonderful things about tonight is we have 3, perhaps 4 teachers who are struggling, but all said how grateful they were, how lucky they felt. It's a grumpy time, not just for poorer teachers in the Bay Area. When I started with this, I remember that when Nancy and I moved to Palo Alto, somebody had built the schools and built the libraries and built the parks and paid for them and welcomed me, and nobody said you weren't welcome. I think the missing piece now is for people to remember how grateful and lucky we are to have been here and how we're connected to a past generation. So I end with pay it forward. I joined the commission that Elaine and I served on to do the Palo Alto plan explicitly to speak for people who weren't in the room. Because this is a plan for 10 years and 15 years. It's not a plan for today. I may not be here. Pay it forward. I'm really lucky.
I totally agree with what you're saying, but also I think the system of city council meetings is really broken.
Definitely.
So the whole way that it's done is insane. So basically what happens is the council meetings usually starts like at 7 o'clock at night, and it could go till 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And so what happens is you may have people that want to speak on an issue, and they just basically end up having to leave. So I think what we really need to do in order to really engage the community, like I know, for example, my item was supposed to be heard at 6 o'clock. It wasn't heard till 10:30 at night, and it didn't end till after midnight. And there were actually like school children and teachers, and there were several hundred people there to speak. By 10 o'clock at night, only 30 were left. So, they have to put a limit on these meetings. So maybe they should be from 7 to 9, so that people who commute or people that have a family or, whatever it is, or if there's an item, maybe it's a time certain. They guarantee that this item is going to be heard at no later than 8 o'clock or something like that. Or maybe they should be heard during the day. Maybe people should be able to Skype in or something if they want to speak, because I think what the group is talking about is there might be like a really vocal group that show up at these meetings because, I don't know, maybe they're retired, maybe they don't have kids, whatever it is, they're able to go to these meetings, and they're heard, and the other 90% isn't. So I just think the whole way it's done, we really have to relook at it so that the whole community gets involved. Or do they do some of these meetings during the day, maybe at lunchtime, so people can show up? But somehow, I think it would be great, because the best part of my project has been to see how much people actually really do care. I mean, there's just thousands of people out there that really care about housing, but because of the way the system's designed, they feel like they can't engage, like they have, I have a child too. I mean, it's hard to, go to 2 or 3 meetings a week with.
So maybe there's a new way of getting people engaged that increases how many of them are visible in front of the planning commissions and the councils, and I don't know what that is, but I don't,
Right.
what is it?
Take pictures. Have people with a sign say where they work, what part of the community they are. Right? I work at Gun. I support whatever it is you support. Take a picture,
So-
send it to the city council.
Instead of humans of New York, it's people who care about housing in the Silicon Valley. There's got to be a better name than that.
Sure.
But
Housers of Silicon
yeah,
Valley.
yeah.
Just to add to this conversation, and Violet probably knows this, working with underprivileged households, we struggle, and we're really working on it, is how to give them a voice. How do you empower our residents to speak up and share their voices, to fight for other residents like them, to fight for a more diverse and inclusive community? So we're really working on empowering our residents. In Palo Alto alone, we have about 2,500 residents, but many of them are scared to speak up. They don't show up at the council meetings. They're afraid that if they talk about their financial situation, their limitations, that they're going to be looked down upon, or their kids are going to be looked down upon, so they don't show up. So we have to find a way to empower them so that they feel good, that they have a voice.
I'd just like to add that I think what came out from the situation last night and this morning with the protest, the neighborhood, the people that own homes on this street, were actually the people that were voicing their concerns for the people that were living in the RVs. So
That's nice.
I think it was a very positive outcome this morning, and there were also lawyers that were there to help protect these families. And but it's actually giving these people voices. There are also other situations that limits them from doing these things, from voicing out their concerns. And we all know very well these days, the issue with immigration, and that's another barrier, and language is also another barrier in this community. So it's very hard for them to stand for themselves.
I think in some ways, we've used social media for petitions, and they've lost some of their power to say we collected, 100,000 names nationally or something. But I think we're on to something, that there's got to be some new creative ways to bring these voices forward, even if the people can't attend a meeting, from whether it's language or whether they have kids to put to sleep or whether they're afraid of, how they'll look in front of other people. I remember being at a meeting at a community center probably in the early 90s, and every year I would worry, was our rent going to go up to a point where we couldn't live in Palo Alto? And I have worked at the media center since 90, and I remember asking he passed away, but a wonderful councilman at that time, Gary Fazzino, what about rent control here? He said, Elliot, it's politically unfeasible. Forget that one. And it was like he's a friend saying that. And somehow now in Mountain View, they passed, it is 25 years later. I don't know what it is that changes things exactly, but it sounds like what everybody's saying is change is about people becoming visible. Yes.
I have a little twist on that. My heart is for all housing and for housing for middle income people. But when I go to council, I'm going to talk about Candace's project. I think it is much more powerful to speak for someone else and show shared concern than for everybody to come up and speak for themselves. I tell my workforce board to go to the state legislature and not to ask for workforce money. Every other workforce board is doing it. I tell them, go say, you put your money in pre-K education, because if you do that, we're going to have fewer, harder to employ people. I think, get engaged, but I think it's more powerful to speak for someone else but yourself. And someone else then speaks for you.
Can I chime in real quick?
Yes.
So I can relate to a lot of what's been said, particularly about the ability to share your voice in the community or at school board meetings, which I think are a microcosm of what you're talking about,
Sure.
the Palo Alto council meetings.
Yes.
I remember those kinds of long meetings happening at the school board. They were ridiculous. Changes have been made recently where they've done a lot of what you were talking about, Sarah, is actually setting time limits and sticking to them. But I think also, and this kind of, I guess, comes full circle, is that because so many of us teachers and I'm sure firefighters and police and nurses that can't afford to live in the communities in which they work, they are also therefore not voters in that community. And so we don't get to vote for things that are in our interest in our community. That's one thing. The other thing, of course, is because we live out of the community and because my 10-mile drive to Sunnyvale sometimes takes me 45 minutes, which compared to the Santa Cruz drive, I now feel even more grateful. But to other people's point, I can't make a lot of those meetings. I have to go home. I've got a family. And for me to come back to that meeting and then go home again, you take somebody who's living in Santa Cruz and that's just a non-starter. So in terms of voices, I love the idea of speaking for others. I think that's a really powerful idea, and I agree with that completely. At the same time, I also agree that individual voices are important. But to your point, it has to be more than just a signature on a page. You brought up the idea of kind of taking pictures. I would go one step further, which gets more to the Humans of New York thing and doing videos. So I guess what I'm getting at is that I get excited about the idea of somebody really organizing the collection of that kind of testimony and those stories. One of the things that I do in my job and my work, I'm a part-time teacher actually in the classroom, and the other part of my work at Pally is dealing with a lot of our wellness and social emotional learning efforts. As we all know, Palo Alto has struggled with a lot of stuff when it comes to mental health and wellness. And one of the things that I've really come to learn about this work is that the true power in healing is in sharing stories. And we don't share stories when we sign on a piece of paper. We don't share stories when we just say a picture saying, I'm for this, although that's a step in the right direction. We share stories when we share stories. And we can't share stories if we aren't there to share our story. And so if we can find, to your point, more creative ways that are more in line with the resources that we have today that everybody's plugged into, to really allow people to share their stories, as we're basically doing today, those voices get heard. And that excites me out of all this conversation is the possibility of something like that.
I totally agree in that, over the past 2 years, we've had some support from Cal Humanities and actually the company SurveyMonkey to do stories of dreamers, the undocumented youth who've been protected by DACA, but maybe not much more. And gosh, the people in the room, the energy is electric when they're just listening to and kind of being in the homes and in the families of these dreamers who are sharing pieces of their lives. And it's a change agent. I don't know how you do it on a more mass scale. We might have 200 people in a room listening, but it does feel like, boy, something happened here tonight.
I think Catherine wanted to say something.
Oh, I just wanted to add on that. As an English teacher, we teach a lot about empathy, and I think that we have a lot to learn from our kids and our children. Like, at the root of every human is the kind heart, and I think that by sharing these stories, like, it really reaches with that and human connection, and that despite the clamoring of like being against affordable housing or against any building of to hear the stories about those 1,000 students leaving the district, it just should strike a chord within everyone. And then, yeah.
Catherine, can you go close to the mic?
Okay. Basically, the story that Violet was saying about 1,000 students leaving the district, that should strike a chord in everyone and just make them realize what's at hand here.
We're getting down to the last few minutes of our time here, and first of all, thanks so much for spending an evening after a full day's work. And I just want to open it up. If there's something you would feel bad you didn't say if you left here tonight and didn't say it now.
I just want to say one thing about a shared concern, which is high-tech workers as well are struggling with housing issues. So the cost of an average house, I think, in this area is about $1.2 million. So you actually have to make about, well, not in Palo Alto, but you actually have to make a minimum of, let's say, $175,000 a year to qualify for that house. And one of the things that really spurred me on, because I started this project a couple years ago, is I met with this single mother. She had gotten divorced. Her husband got the house in the divorce. She had 2 kids. And she actually was a high-tech worker. She worked for a big company that makes phones. And I won't name it, but, you know, it's also a fruit. But anyway, basically, when I sat down with her and we started going through, you know, what she could qualify for and everything in terms of purchasing a home, she was living paycheck to paycheck. And she was making about $175,000 a year. And because, you know, when you're paying $3,500 a month in rent and you have 2 kids, you know, that, and half of that goes to 401k plan and tax deductions,
Right.
you know, you're really only maybe bringing home like $6,000 a month. So, well, if you're paying $3,500 a month in rent, and you know, I think everyone knows how expensive it is to live here. That is paycheck to paycheck. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I think one of the reasons, like, we might be able to really move forward on this housing issue is because it's affecting, like, from the lowest earners to people that, I mean, you think, wow, you know, they make $175,000 a year. But when you break that down in this area, they still can't save the money to get a down payment to buy a house. So I just wanted to, sometimes, you know, people, there's a little bit of tech bashing or whatever you want to call it. But the tech workers themselves, unless they're really high up there, are actually also struggling too.
So we've identified so many reasons to share the concern. Hopefully, those of us sitting at this table came up with something new to do or some new energy to bring forward because it's needed. And those watching this hopefully will draw something to join these arm in arms that we're going to be out there. These photos of humans of housing shortage. And so from all of us here and all of us out there, let's keep this issue on our radar screens because it's so important to our quality of life. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. We can get up and leave, it's okay. The cameras will fade out as we're leaving. And anybody who's still hungry, stuff your pockets with cake and cookie.